My name's Josh, also go by Monk, and I'm going to be talking about NAND flash and all the fun we can have. Before I get started, this was a cyber fast track project funded by DARPA, and just kind of wanted to say thank you to Mudge for doing that. It's awesome. Who am I? I'm an applied research geek at Accuvant Labs. I don't know. I actually, when I'm sitting in the audience, I always hate the who am I thing, so I'm going to skip it. But if you want to know more, find me, chat with me. I'm at monk.dot on Twitter. So when I started this project, I was doing a lot of implant work and whatnot, and just thinking about how that whole industry works. And I realized at the time I was doing a lot of air to glass type stuff, right? So I want to get on a device. I get on the device. I never touch storage. I am purely over the air to the glass or the screen, and then on a reboot I'm gone. No persistence, but really hard to find me if I'm trying to evade detection of whatever code I'm running. That was awesome and really reliable, other than the fact that I disappear when someone reboots a phone. I didn't really like that. It started getting in the way. So I started looking at how can I persist and still stay just as hidden, just as secure as I was if I was doing pure air to glass. So I started looking at how data is stored on things like cell phones or SCADA or anything like that. And everything pointed me back to NAND flash. So I was like, how does that work? Which is this Prezzo. And when I started thinking about it, I was like, oh, well, if that's how it works, then yeah, we can totally hide files. And then thinking about it a little more, it kind of logically had this leap of like, oh crap, yeah, we can hide files, but that just became really boring compared to what we can actually do with NAND. So I can all the things, and after this hour, you can too. Yeah, I'm gonna do the intro, which I just did. I'm gonna talk about defense actually twice, really quickly both times, because it's almost trivial. I'm gonna just kind of go through how NAND works is a nice intro, and point out the logical flaws that are there and why this whole setup works and how you can use it and how you can move, take my proof of concept to the next level if you wanted to. And I'll talk about forensics as well, because if you're trying to hide things, you typically care about forensics. Too long didn't read of the whole talk if you actually want to walk out now. Everything is on GitHub. Everything's open source, and I'm going to talk about all the demos. Everything's there. So defense, too long didn't read. What we're going to take advantage of today is built into the hardware. It was a design choice when they made NAND. It's not something that can really be fixed. It can't be patched. Even if you could patch hardware, it can't really be patched because it's an intrinsic way that NAND works that I'm taking advantage of. So there are potential ways to kind of duct tape, Band-Aid around this that we'll get to at the end, but really none of those solutions that I've come up with so far are actually valid to fully defeat this attack. It's just kind of intrinsic in the way the hardware works. So the only real way you could bypass this is just to not use NAND, which given that solid state drives on laptops, SCADA, the whole list uses NAND, that's not really practical. So again, science is hard. I'm going to try to do a quick explanation for NAND for the people in the audience that haven't spent the ungodly hours reading the docs. I'm going to also try to simplify some things because they just makes what I'm going to show you make a little more sense. If you know NAND really well and you see where I mess things up, please don't get mad at me. So NAND, basically we're talking about trapping electrons at the base of everything. That's how it works. So I'm going to call a single place that traps a single electron is a bucket. It is a bit. If there's an electron in there, you've got a 1. If there's not, it's a 0. These are logically created or logically packaged into pages. Pages are typically 512, 2048, 90, or 4096. I mean your typical computer numbers, right, of bytes. And then those pages are actually then wrapped into blocks. The blocks is what we actually typically care about, because like 512, that's actually enough to store some data that I care about. You get any smaller than that and why bother? But half a meg, I'm cool with that. So when you when you wipe NAND completely, instead of zeros like you would kind of mentally expect, you get all Fs, right? Like the whole array, our nice little beer pong table here, every cup is filled up with an electron. It's much easier to drink the beer than it is to refill the beer on one of the middle cups. So shifting to 0 is easy. You can just let the electron go. Shifting back to 1 is really hard. There's no easy way to do it, so they actually do it on a whole page or a whole block mechanism, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So, like I said, it's a trap. We have the nice little picture there that just kind of shows basically you have 2 gates and you're going to trap an electron in a nice little bucket. These things, are obviously small. They are fragile. During the typical use of a device, NAND's lifetime has gotten better, but originally we were seeing like 10 to 100,000 writes and the whole thing's just dead. Now we're up in the millions as far as how they're building hardware, but still it is logically that gate is going to fail and die. That's built into the hardware. Because we know that the hardware is going to fail, we build in wear leveling so we're not always hitting the first block every time we want to save data. There's a nice little Turing machine typically built in the embedded controller that does wear leveling over the whole space of memory. Because of that, we have a lot of wear leveling residue, what we'll come back to way at the very end. So here's a typical diagram of how NAND works from Toshiba, which are the people that claim to have invented the technology. It's a little too low level for what I want to get to, so we're going to talk about this diagram, which just simplifies it. For what we're going to talk about today, we have 2 different types of NAND we care about. We have managed NAND and raw NAND, or NAND flash. The only difference is raw NAND is simply just the gates and the traps. Everything else is managed in software, like in the kernel or in whatever RTOS you're running, whatnot. Managed NAND has a small embedded Turing machine in the actual NAND chip that does on-device wear leveling. It takes care of, it moves a lot of the code from a driver into the actual hardware. Below that Turing machine level, it's the exact same NAND hardware. It all works the exact same. Everything that I'm going to talk about with raw NAND can also almost just as easily be done in managed NAND. The only reason we'll talk about raw is simply because it's kernel code. We can kind of understand it and latch into it a lot easier than trying to talk about weird embedded firmware stuff. So, like I said, NAND breaks. What happens when it breaks? We have 3 things that we care about. We have ECC values. So we know that single bits in NAND will break. So there's error correction values that are stored that, sometimes they work like forward error correction like you would have in a network stack or whatnot. But a lot of times it's just flags saying this could potentially be bad. Once you hit a threshold that's set, like in the kernel, for how many bits in a block become bad and can't be used, can't be flipped correctly when you want them to, that block gets marked bad, and then it's stored in the bad block table, the BBT. Every NAND device has a BBT or something similar to a BBT. And all that does is say, I am no longer trustworthy, never ever ever store data in me again, I don't exist. So if you format the drive, it doesn't touch the bad block. Anything that's marked in the bad block table just doesn't get touched anymore, ever. By the kernel, by firmware, it's gone. So we're going to have fun with that. Bad block is normally stored in the out of bounds area of NAND, so it's an area that typically isn't writable. It's supposed to be hard to mark blocks bad. I did a lot of research on a whole bunch of different embedded and raw NAND controllers, and I basically found 3 use cases that they run through. You have some NAND devices that actually, when the kernel boots up the first time on like a cell phone, it runs through and kind of does some analysis on every block of NAND, and it creates a bad block table in RAM. That bad block table in RAM is then written back to NAND like during a shutdown, so when it comes back up, it just reads what it already wrote and doesn't have to do the analysis again. This is really cool because if you're attacking that type of a platform, you really only have to attack the bad block table that's in RAM and then politely reboot the phone and things disappear. That's in the spec. There's use cases online showing that that exists. I haven't actually found one in the real world. Normally what I've found during this research is the second bullet, which is some systems use basically out of bounds markers. So you'll have a block of 512 and then surrounding that you'll have a page at the beginning or end, like 16K or something. That is used to a whole bunch of flags for like error correction values, blah, 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 and is this block good or bad? So you have to be able to write out of the bounds of where the kernel can normally access NANDs to write things. It can request the driver do it, but there's no direct, like, I want to raw write here. That just doesn't, that code doesn't exist, technically, in the Linux kernel or the Android kernel. And then some other devices basically store a whole bad block table either at the very beginning or the very end of NAND. You're kind of, at that point, you're just looking at like a negative address. You can't actually address that space. So if you go to like, you know, memory address 0 in NAND, that's going to be the start of your data. You would really have to go to like -512, and then there's your bad block table. But regardless, it's stored somewhere. So again, that's what we want to get to because we want to be able to mark blocks bad. As I touched on previously, you kind of have raw NAND, which has a very complex driver because it's having to do all the wear leveling in software, or you have an MMC, EMC, the more managed NAND that has a really simple driver for Android and Linux and whatnot. But they do the same thing. It's just whether the wear leveling is in software kernel driver or if it's embedded. All the wear leveling is proprietary vendor information. So none of the algorithms are really understood in the public sector, which we'll take advantage of when we get to forensics. And everything has a kernel, or I mean everything has an API, so I can just call it directly. I don't have to do any leet hackery things, I just have to write code. So in software, when we're talking raw NAND on every Linux distro I've looked at and every Android kernel I've looked at, when we're using raw NAND, we use the MTD subsystem. It's like a huge meta driver that does a ton of stuff. Almost everything that I end up thinking, ooh, that would be interesting to look at in Android is in MTD. So I started looking at, okay, how I want to be able to mark blocks bad because I know then they will exist. You know, I can write data to them and then mark them bad and then nothing sees them. That's what I want. So what has the ability on a system to do that? You have YAFs and other file systems that are pretty high level that do that. But if you start telling the file system to mark a block bad, then there's a lot of residue that you wrote stuff there. So that's a little higher level than you want to play with. You've got MTD in the driver level, which is the rest of this presentation. You could do it directly in the kernel, but then you got to compile your own kernel and it's a pain, and I mean, why? That's not clean. If you've got embedded like Turing machines, you can start playing with flash transition layers and the embedded controllers. I've got some non-public work on that I'd love to talk about, but it's not in this prezo. And the other way you could actually pop this that I haven't looked at very hard is just poor user land coding. I mean, users have the ability to read and write from the disk. So at some point something can catch that and say this is bad. So if you found privileged escalation, like it wouldn't be as straight up, I get root access. It would just be like, I can accidentally make this call I shouldn't. So when I started this, I wanted to kill NAND, and I figured it would be a nice hardware reversing gig, which I'm more used to. So I bought a bunch of gear to do that, and then started doing the research and realized that I could just kind of throw all that away. So I went shopping for phones, because I was looking for something that had raw NAND. I bought a ton. I basically bought phones off eBay, ran a couple commands, and then sold them back on eBay. If you got some of my phones, I'm really, really sorry. But, and then I kind of like, I ran out of money or ran out of time, or just like, I needed more phones because I want this mythical phone that uses like raw NAND. That's a vendor I can talk about. So like I did it, and then I called JDuck because he's a coworker, and he ran a whole bunch of tests on his whole Android lab, and called some other friends that were doing research, and we finally found a couple that use RAW. The one I'm going to pick on today is the Sony Xperia Arc S. It was a phone from a couple of years ago. It's a nice little phone. I've got a couple. If you want to see a demo or dive down deeper, I'll have some on me tomorrow. The one I was going to do a live demo on today kind of caught fire earlier. So when we run partitions on this, we can see everything is actually straight up MTD. There's no, well, you can see the two MMC blocks down at the bottom, but we don't really care about that. So we see 4 partitions that are managed by MTD. And then when we look at the actual proc MTD, we can see that the partitions that are in raw unmanaged, or raw NAND are system, apps log, cache, and user data. I'm like, sweet, now I can touch the system, right? That's what I want to kill. So I do it. I start looking more into the test cases. I start looking more into the code and the kernel to see how everything works. And I start noticing that all of the test cases for unmanaged NAND are running as side-loadable kernel modules. Like, that's even awesomer. I don't have to do a kernel, right? So I'm like, I'm just going to write some unit tests that start breaking NAND. And I wrote 3 of them that we'll go into. I've got NAND hide, which actually starts killing NAND and hiding the data that we want. And then I've got 2 kind of finders that just, at least for a Prezzo, let you see what I'm doing. I'm not actually doing much rocket science here at all. Everything I'm doing is basically calling the API at a very low layer to do it for me. There's a handful of exceptions to that. The one is the out of bounds write, which if you try to call it even as the kernel directly, you're going to get access denied. Like it doesn't like it for some quirky reason. I mean, Ring 0 can, but not. But I just took the driver code that was there, rewrote it with my own calls to skip a couple of security checks, and just call that directly, and that's completely fine. So what we're going to do for the demo is I'm going to pick a block. We're going to pick on block 37, just some random block that I picked. I'm going to write dead beef over the whole thing, like just 512K, just dead beef. And I'm going to mark it as bad. After we mark it as bad, we're going to zero out the whole out of bounds area. That's going to actually mark the block as bad. It just won't exist. The system can't see it anymore. It's gone. And then quirkily, because I picked block 37, we get a nice catch and release collision that reboots the phone. And that is actually useful because when it boots back up, that block is completely gone because the kernel is reinitialized from the bad block table and caught that block disappeared. So the code is really simple. We have, I'm basically picking a block, erasing it, writing my buffer back, and then marking bad. I'm actually having to mark bad twice because the first API call always fails. I'm not sure why it's in there, and I'm not sure if you legitimately call it if it fails or not, but I never got it to work. But for completeness, because I was open sourcing the code, I wanted to put it in there for other people to look at. When I'm marking things bad, like I said, the first one always fails, so I always see that why mark bad. This time we just do it a little differently. We call one level lower in the API, and we get it every time. So block 37 happens to be where settings.app is stored on Android phones, at least all the phones that I've touched. So when we kill it, we get this. com.android setting has stopped because it's no longer there. It used to be on disk, it used to be loadable, and now it's not because that block has just disappeared from the world. So when we reboot the phone again, and we get every time we get that because it's just gone. So the find system that I'm also releasing just does a check. It does a very low level bypassing any direct like kernel level APIs and just going straight to a driver, iterating through the device and looking for any blocks that are marked bad. And then it's just going to list them just so we can see, yay, I marked block 37 bad, it's bad. Then if we go to complex, ooh, that is ugly. Let me show the better logs for complex. No, we'll come back to them in the end. Complex, you can basically see that the first 16K is all just zeros because we're just printing out that whole block. So the first 16K are zeros because that's where the bad block table is, and everything else we're just releasing all the electrons. And then the rest of it is just dead beef, the whole thing. I can do this because I'm specifically, when I rewrote my driver system to do this, I'm bypassing that simple check saying, is this block bad? If it is, don't read from it. So if I'm calling directly from the kernel, that doesn't work. It just sees this as bad and it never, ever, ever finds it. If I run a DD on the device, that DD still checks the bad block table. So even if I'm trying to do a raw forensics dump, typically this doesn't drop. There are a couple of advanced-ish commands in DD that you could at least catch this if I was dumb enough to just write dead beef everywhere. But every forensics tool that I played with, including the simple things, just nothing found this block once I marked it bad. It disappears, which is awesome because obviously I can still read and write to it. So it is memory that nothing can see, but you have complete control over. Because the world sucks without a demo. Here's mine. Like I said, the phone that I was playing with, it just really doesn't work. I've got some new ones that I'll bring. I'll have them in my bag tomorrow. But here I am insmodding the kernel module that has the exploity thing in it. And as soon as I do it, we get a beautiful Android crash that is like the sexiest crash screen I've seen, where it just like fades out to nothing and the phone's dead. And then you reboot and you get that screenshot from earlier of settings is gone. Yeah, so once a block is bad, it is bad. There's no logical way in any of the API and any of the code that's in like the Linux kernel to mark a block good again. That code doesn't exist. Doesn't mean you can't write it, because it's trivial, it's just a bit flip, but it does not exist the way computers work right now. And it doesn't for a reason, right? Because typically blocks go bad because hardware's failing. You don't want to arbitrarily mark things good because then the kernel will trust them, it'll try writing to them, and then you lose all your data. It makes no sense, therefore it's a one-way switch. When you flash a new ROM, that new ROM is still looking at the bad block table, so it's not going to write over that. If you do a factory reset, it's not going to write over that. Any of the tools that you would typically do for Android will not touch that bad block, which means I can take my phone, write dead beef over half of it, put a new ROM, put new kernel, do a factory reset, and I've still got dead beef over half of it, and nothing can see it but me. So if that's a nice rootkit or something like that, all I need is one little jump after a complete refresh, complete clean install of a phone. I need one jump to get back into my code because I've still got 5 megs, 10 megs of code there that you're just never going to see. But like I said, you can start eating blocks in 512K bytes. Originally, I just wanted to hide code, and then I was like, wait, I can eat a drive at half a mega pop, which we'll come back to in 1 second. So if you're trying to actually do an exploit with this, or you're trying to get reliable, deep, hidden code on a device, you do have to realize that if you start mucking with the bad block table, that block disappears. That means any of the nice things that you would normally rely on for NAND, like ECC values that will automatically compute and take care of the individual bits that occasionally legitimately are dead on your block, all those protections go away. So if you're actually writing this in the real world, you need to just call that API back on your dead blocks. It's not rocket science, but it just does need to be done. So, yay. Like I said, most forensics tools don't find me, but how could they? Let's say we write new tools and they're better. So let's play that game mentally for a second. I write new tools, now I am going to drop all the bad blocks. Remember way back at the beginning I said where leveling was proprietary, we don't understand it. That means that you don't know how data is actually supposed to look on a block. So if you see a block that's bad and you mark it as good again and start trying to do analysis on it, it's very difficult, even with blocks that you know are good, to traverse through NAND correctly and actually figure out what the last version of the file is and what's junk and what's not. I mean, it's doable. We've crossed that it's impossible barrier, but it's still not 100% reliable. It's not 100% trustworthy. Once you take into the account that something could theoretically actually be bad, you start playing that game, and you're playing a game where you don't understand what that data is actually supposed to look like at rest. It's really easy for me to hide. I don't have to just write 512K of dead beef. I can write, 1 byte every 50. I don't get a huge chunk of memory to store data in, but I can start interleaving my data with residual junk, and it becomes very, very difficult to find me, even if you've got the tools. So, okay, now we understand the first part of the work. Let's kind of revisit that defense in general that I said at the beginning is not there. It could get better forensics tools, and we really should. We should start getting like runtime tools for the kernel that starts looking at why are blocks failing so quickly. Like if 20 blocks are marked bad on a device between reboots, something's probably wrong. But other than that, any other kind of trickery you start thinking of starts not really making sense. I mean, the last best suggestion I got from people was, okay, every time the kernel reboots, let's look at the bad block table, and everything that's in the bad block table, let's release everything and just make sure that it's all zeros, or write ones to or FFF across everything that's a bad block, and then verify. Well, you can do that, but remember, it fails legitimately. Bits go bad. You can't write. You can't release. So that kernel trickery would kind of work, but it would fail really quickly, or it would be unreliable very, very, very fast. I'm not saying it's not a good path to go down, but it doesn't feel legit to me. And again, we still have to use NAND. So we can arbitrarily hide data on NAND, and there's really nothing we can do about it. And I was talking to my boss, and he had the JT went full Oppenheimer quote, which I loved. So I wanted to hide things, and then I realized I could start eating data, and I was like, well, what can I do with that? My first thought was, like, if I want to exfiltrate a whole bunch of data out of a network, it really sucks if I'm trying to exfil gigs and gigs and gigs and gigs and gigs of like raw corporate data, right? So what if I didn't have to exfil it? What if I just say, like, screw it, I'm just going to mark every block that I want data on that drive is bad. What's the user going to do? The user's going to go complain to IT. IT is going to go, they're going to forensically wipe the drive so none of the corporate data gets, out into the wild. And at some point that drive's going to go in the trash. So because none of the tools actually wipe bad blocks, I've just physically exfilled gigs or terabytes of data simply by just making any of that IT guy's tools work. That was thought one, and that was kind of fun. And then we went a step further and started looking at, okay, there are a ton of SCADA devices that use NAND. There are a ton of just embedded devices in general around the world that use NAND. If you start eating the drive from them by just arbitrarily marking blocks bad, again, nothing recovers them, so once they're marked bad, you can't restore the machine. If it's an Android phone, that's annoying and you get pissed off. If that's some flow control on an oil pipeline that you've remotely popped and just killed, that thing can't be fixed over the air. That can't even really be reflashed in person. You physically have to replace SCADA devices, or at least the drives on SCADA devices. That becomes scary to me, at least. And I guess interesting. So, my requests would be have fun with the research, but be cool. Maybe also try to find a better fix than I have, because my fix is talking to y'all and telling you about it. So at least we all know that there's a problem. And again, please leave feedback. I'm going to finish a little earlier so I can take questions. But as an appreciation for you leaving feedback, I'll tell you a little bit about panic write. If you start looking in the Linux kernel, in a handful of places you'll see the call to panic write. Panic write is designed, and panic write takes a couple of arguments. One is data, and one is exactly where on NAND you want to write that data. The concept is a black box flight recorder. If you have a device like that, you want to write to NAND no matter what. So you get kernel faults, you want to write to NAND. Panic write basically just says, I don't care privileges, I don't care where I'm supposed to write, none of that. I bypass all the securities and I write whatever you tell me, wherever you tell me to go. So if you played with panic write mixed with, I don't know, just anytime you segfault, you could probably have a lot of fun. And that is my gift to you for leaving feedback. Any questions?
On the managed NAND side, you can still read back the blocks that are marked bad the firmware doesn't check?
So I'm going to repeat the question. On the managed NAND side, he's asking, can you still read back and arbitrarily write to blocks that are marked bad? The only difference in the code that I've released, and you would basically have to port my code to the embedded controller. At that point, you still have the same arbitrary ability that you would normally. The only extra step in that exploit over the nice open sourcey exploit is you'd have to be able to pop and get the ability to read and write firmware on that controller, which I'm not making public. Yes? Yes, so the solid state hard drives would encrypt all the data that goes on there if you want to exfil. This is true unless you also mark where the encryption keys are stored on device is bad, at which point it's like an iPhone, right? You know where the keys on an iPhone are. You may have to do a little bit of work, but you can still get them. It's not perfect, it's not as clean as if it wasn't encrypted, but if it's done in hardware, then yeah, you'd probably not be able to do it. That's true. So yay for hardware encryption. Any more questions? Awesome. Well, thank everybody for coming out. I appreciate it greatly.